Swallows and Amazons by Arthur Ransome. Roger, aged 7, and no longer the youngest of the family, ran across the steep field that sloped up from the lake to Holly Howe, the farm where they were staying for part of the summer holidays. His mother was awaiting him at the gate. He saw that she had in her hand a small piece of white paper, a telegram. He knew at once what it was. He knew that telegrams came only from his father, and that this one must be the answer to a letter from his mother, and letters from John, Susan, Titty, and himself, all asking the same thing, but asking it in different ways. His own letter had been very short. "Please, Daddy, may I too? With love, Roger." All the letters had gone together, a very long way to his father, whose ship was at Malta, but under orders for Hong Kong. "Does he say yes?" he panted, out of breath. Mother smiled and read the telegram aloud. "Better drowned than duffers. If not duffers, won't drown." "Does that mean yes?" asked Roger. "I think so." "Does it mean me too?" "Yes, if John and Susan will take you, and if you promise to do whatever they tell you." "Hurrah!" shouted Roger, and capered about delightedly. "Where are the others?" asked Mother. "In Darien," said Roger. "Where?" "You know, on the peak. Titty called it that. We can see the island from there." Below the farm at Holly Howe, the field sloped steeply to a little bay where there was a boathouse and a jetty. Halfway down the field there was a gate, and from that gate a path ran into the pine woods that covered the southern promontory. The path soon faded away into nothing, but on the very evening of their first coming, a fortnight before, the children had found their way through the trees to the far end of the promontory, where it dropped like a cliff into the lake. From the top of it, they had looked out over the broad sheet of water winding away among the low hills to the south. And it was then, when they first stood on the cliff and looked out over mile upon mile of water, that Titty had given the place its name. She had heard the sonnet read aloud at school and had forgotten everything in it except the picture of the explorers looking at the Pacific Ocean for the first time. She had called the promontory Darien. "Would you like to take them the answer?" asked Mother. "Yes." "You must give the telegram to John. It's he who has to see that you are not duffers." Mother put the telegram in its red envelope and gave it to Roger. She kissed him and said, "Supper at 7:30, and not a minute later, and mind you don't wake Vicky when you come in." Roger came out of the field into the wood and climbed up through the trees to the top of the promontory. In a hollow of rock, a small fire was burning. John was stoking the fire. Susan was spreading bread and marmalade. Titty, with her hand on her hunched-up knees, was sitting between two trees on the edge of the cliff above the lake, keeping watch and looking at the island. John looked up and saw the telegram. "Dispatches?" he said. "It's the answer," said Roger. "It's yes." John took the telegram. "Read it aloud," said Susan. John read. "Better drowned than duffers. If not duffers, won't drown." "What does it mean?" asked Susan. "It means yes," said Titty. "It means that Daddy thinks we shall none of us get drowned, and that if any of us do get drowned, it's a good riddance," said John. "But if we aren't duffers, we shan't be drowned." "Let's start at once," said Roger. "We can't start tonight," Susan said. "Let's have tea, and then we'll make a list of the things we shall want." "Let's have tea where we can see the island," said Titty. They carried their mugs and the kettle and the tin plate piled with thick slabs of brown bread and marmalade to the edge of the cliff. The island lay about a mile away towards the lower, southern end of the lake, its trees reflected in the glassy water. They had been looking at it for 10 days, but the telegram had made it much more real than ever it had been before. It was not just an island, it was their island. With an island like that within sight, who could be content to live on the mainland and sleep in a bed at night? They had gone back and told their mother of their discovery, and begged that the whole family should leave the farmhouse the next day and camp on the island forever. But there was little Vicky, a fat baby, like the pictures of Queen Victoria in old age, full of all sorts of needs. Mother couldn't take Vicky and the nurse to camp even on the best of uninhabited islands, nor without leave from Daddy could she let them go alone. And though John and Susan were both well able to manage a sailing boat, Titty and Roger had only begun to learn how to sail when their father had been home on leave a year before. In the boathouse below the farm there was a 14-foot dinghy, the Swallow. With a lake as big as a small sea, a sailing boat with a brown sail waiting in the boathouse, and the little wooded island waiting for explorers, nothing but a sailing voyage of discovery seemed worth thinking about. So the letters had been written and posted, and day after day the children had been camping on the peak of Darien by day and sleeping in the farmhouse by night. And now, suddenly, it was real. It was to be their island after all. They were to be allowed to use the sailing boat by themselves. They were to be allowed to sail out from the little sheltered bay and round the point and down the lake to the island. They were to be allowed to land on the island and to live there until it was time to pack up again and go home to town and school and lessons. John took a sheet of paper and a pencil from his pocket. "Let's make the ship's articles," he said. The bread and marmalade had all been eaten, so he turned the plate upside down and put the paper on the back of it, and lay on his stomach on the rock. He wrote, "Sailing vessel, Swallow. Port, Holly Howe. Owners, Walkers Limited." Underneath that he wrote, "Master, John Walker. Mate, Susan Walker. Able seaman, Titty Walker. Ship's boy, Roger. Now," he said, "you all have to sign opposite your names." They all signed. "Well, Mr. Mate," said John, "how soon do you think we should be ready to put to sea?" "We can't really sail until everything is ready," said Susan. "Let's make a list of the things we'll need." "Compass," said John. "Kettle," said Susan. "A flag," said Titty. "I'll make one with a swallow on it." "Tents," said Roger. "Telescope," said John. "Saucepan, mugs, knives, forks, tea, sugar, milk," said Susan, writing as hard as she could go. "And sleeping bags," said Roger. They kept remembering things and then getting stuck, and then remembering some more until there was no more room on the paper. And then they all went home to bed. When they'd finished loading the supplies into the Swallow the next morning, there was very little room left for themselves. They managed to squeeze in somehow, and then Mother said, "Well, if you're ready, you'd better start." "Now, Mr. Mate," said Captain John. "All aboard!" cried Mate Susan. "We are all aboard," said Roger. He was sitting in the bows, and Titty was sitting on the middle thwart. John hooked the yard to the traveller on the mast and hauled up the little brown sail and made the halyard fast. Titty's flag with the dark blue swallow on a white ground was already at the masthead. John went aft to the tiller. Susan pulled down the boom until the sail was setting properly. There was a very light northwesterly wind. Mother held the end of the painter, and then, when the little sail filled, she threw it to Roger, who coiled it down and stuffed it away under his feet. Very slowly, the Swallow slid away from the jetty. "Goodbye, Mother! Goodbye, Vicky! Goodbye, Nurse! Goodbye! Goodbye!" came from the jetty. Mother waved her handkerchief, Nurse waved hers, and Vicky waved a fat hand. The crew of the Swallow waved back. The little boat slipped slowly out towards the mouth of the bay. She made at first no noise and hardly any wake. Then, as she came clear of the northerly side of the bay, she found a little more wind, and the cheerful lapping noise began under her forefoot, while her wake lengthened out and bubbled astern of her. Captain John held on straight out of the bay until he could see into the bay on the other side of the point. Far away down the lake, the island showed. John let out the main sheet and put the helm up. The boom swung out, the Swallow swung round, and with the wind aft, John steered straight for the island. As they passed the second cape beyond Darien, Roger, the lookout, reported a ship and pointed towards the shore. In the bay beyond the cape lay a strange-looking dark blue vessel. She was a long, narrow craft with a high, raised cabin roof and a row of glass windows along her side. Her bows were like the bows of an old-time clipper. Her stern was like that of a steamship. There was an awning over her afterdeck, and under it a big fat man was sitting writing in a deck chair. The vessel was moored to a large buoy. "It's a houseboat," said John. "What is a houseboat?" asked Titty. "It's a boat used instead of a house. There was one at Falmouth, where people used to live all the year round." "I wonder," Titty said, "if the man on the houseboat is a retired pirate." Just then a harsh squawk sounded over the water, and a large green bird, which they hadn't noticed, shook itself where it stood perched on the rail that ran round the stern of the houseboat. "He is a pirate," said Roger. "There's his parrot." Before they could see any more, the next little cape hid the houseboat from them. They were getting near the island now. "Keep a lookout for a good landing place," said Captain John. "And keep a lookout for savages," said Titty. "We don't know yet that it is uninhabited, and you can't be too careful." The island was covered with trees, and among them were oaks, hazels, beeches, and rowans, and one tall pine which stood out high above the others. They had often looked at it through the telescope from Darien. The tall pine was near the north end of the island. Below it was a little cliff dropping to the water. Rocks showed a few yards out from the shore, and there was no place to land there. John steered to pass between the island and the mainland, not too near the island, so as not to lose the wind. In a moment or two, Swallow was slipping through smooth water, though there was still enough wind to keep her slowly moving. A little more than a third of the way along the eastern shore of the island, there was a bay, a very small one, with a pebbly beach. Behind it, there seemed to be a clearer space among the trees. "What a place for a camp," said Susan. "It's not much of a harbour," said Captain John, "but if it's the only one, it'll have to do. We can haul the ship well up. Stand by to take in sail. Lower away." Mate Susan was all ready with a halyard in her hand. She slackened the halyard without letting go of it. Down came the sail. "Grab the yard, Roger." Roger grabbed it. Susan unhooked the traveller, and she and Roger together brought down the sail and the yard. When the sail was down, Swallow still had enough way on her to slide in towards the beach. There was a gentle grumble and scrunch, and Swallow's nose was on the pebbly beach. She'd hardly touched before Roger had jumped ashore with the painter. "The first thing to do," said Susan, "is to find the best place for our camp. Not too easily seen from anywhere," said Titty as they scrambled ashore. "We want a flat bit of ground with trees to hold the tents up," said John. "And a good place for a fire," said Susan. "Is it safe to leave the things here?" said Titty. "There might be a tidal wave 40 feet high, washing over everything." "Not as big as that," said John. "That would cover the island." "Hello? Where's that boy?" said the mate. The boy, Roger, was exploring already. Just then he shouted from close to them, behind some bushes, "Someone's had a fire here before!" The others ran up from the little beach. Between the landing place and the high part of the island where the big pine tree was, there was a round, open space of mossy ground. There were trees round the edge of it, and in the middle of it there was a round place where the turf had been scraped away. Roger was there, looking at a neat ring of stones, making a fireplace with the ashes of an old fire in it. At opposite sides of the ring, 2 stout forked sticks had been driven into the ground and built around with heavy stones. And another long stick was lying across the fireplace in the forks of the 2 upright sticks, so that a kettle could be hung on it over the fire. Someone had had a fire here, and someone was meaning to have a fire again. "Natives," said Titty. "Perhaps they're still here," said Roger. "Come on," said Captain John. "We'll go all over it." There was really not very much of the island to explore. It didn't take the crew of the Swallow very long to make sure that, though someone had been on the island sometime, there was nobody but themselves on the island today. They went up to the northern end of the island and looked out over the lake from the high part by the big tree. Then they went to the southern part of the island, but found it rocky and covered with heather and small stunted bushes, growing so thickly that it wasn't easy to push one's way through them. They came back to the fireplace. "The natives knew how to choose the right place," said Susan. "And it's a fine fireplace." "There are no natives on the island now," said Roger. "They may have been killed and eaten by other natives," said Titty. "Anyhow, this is the best place for a camp," said John. "Let's put the tents up at once." So they set about making their camp. They brought the tent bundles up from the landing place, unrolled them, and set up the 2 tents. Then all the rest of the stores were brought up from the beach. Mate Susan began to think about dinner. Able seaman Titty and the boy, Roger, were sent to gather firewood. Presently a fire was burning in the blackened ring of stones. Susan found a place by the landing beach where it was easy to stand on 2 rocks and dip a kettle full of clean water. She came back with the kettle and slung it on the cross stick over the fire. "Everything's all right," said Captain John, "except the landing place. Everybody can see it from the mainland, and if it comes on to blow from the east, it's a very bad place for the Swallow. I'm going to look for a better place." Leaving the mate and the crew to their cooking, he went off to the southern end of the island. He knew that there was nothing that would do for a harbour on the north end of the island or on the west, because there the rock dropped down like a wall of stone into the water. On the eastern side, except for the landing place, it was much the same. But there was just a chance that he might find what he wanted at the south end, where the island broke up into smaller islands. Bare rocks sticking up out of the water, some of them lying so far out that he hadn't thought it was safe to come very near when they'd been sailing round in the Swallow. He took the easiest way through the undergrowth and the small trees. Almost it seemed to him that someone had been that way before. He walked straight into the thing he was looking for. It was a little strip of beach curving round a tiny bay at the end of the island. A thick growth of hazels overhung it and hid it from anyone who'd not actually pushed his way through them. Beyond it, the southwest corner of the island ran out nearly 20 yards into the water, a narrow rock 7 or 8 feet high, rising higher and then dropping gradually. Rocks sheltered it also from the southeast. There was a big rock that was part of the island, and then a chain of smaller ones beyond it. It was no wonder that they thought there was nothing but rocks there when they'd sailed past outside. The water in there was perfectly smooth. It looked as if you could bring a boat in from outside through a narrow channel between the rocks, but of course, under water there might be rocks out there which he couldn't see. He climbed back and hurried to the camp. "I've found the very place," he shouted. "At least, I think I have." "Found what?" said Susan. "A real harbour for Swallow. I don't know yet. I'm going to take her round to see if there is a way in. I must have one of the crew. Can you spare the able seaman?" "Go along, Titty," said the mate. "We'll row her round," said John. "It's no good putting up the sail just to take it down again." Titty sat in the stern while he rowed. Very soon they'd passed the end of the island. John rowed her round outside the farthest of the rocks. "Now," he said, "we'll try to go in. I'll paddle her in, sculling over the stern, and you go forward with the other oar, ready to fend off if there are rocks under water." Captain John unshipped the rudder and put it in the bottom of the boat. Then he began sculling over the stern, gently, enough to make Swallow move slowly in towards the lines of rocks. Titty, with the other oar, was ready in the bows. Slowly, Swallow moved in with the water clear under her keel. At last, the green trees were close ahead, and Swallow was safe in the pool, and ran her nose up the beach in the tiny bay, sheltered by the trees from the north and by the walls of rock from any other wind. "What a place!" said the able seaman. "I expect somebody hid on the island hundreds of years ago and kept his boat here." "It's a perfect harbour," said John. "No one will find her in here." "What did you put the cross on the tree for?" said Titty. "What cross?" said John. "This one." Nearly at the top of a small tree stump, a white cross had been painted on the side nearest to the water. It had been painted some time ago and had faded, and neither John nor Titty had noticed it before. "I didn't put it there," said John. "It must have been there already." Natives again, said Titty sadly. That means that somebody else knows even about the harbour. John made the painter fast round the stump with the white cross on it, and the Swallow lay in the middle of the little harbour in 2 or 3 feet of water. Then they hurried back to camp. The next day was a busy one. It began early. Sunshine in a tent is even more waking than sunshine in a room. Titty woke first and lay awake, looking at patches of sunlight and shadow playing on the white walls of the tent as the sun came through the waving tops of the trees. Then she heard voices in the other tent. They were waking up there too. "Hello," called Titty. "Good morning." John and Roger crawled to the door of their tent. "Where's Susan?" said Roger. "Still asleep." "No, she isn't," said Susan, rolling over on her sleeping bag and rubbing her eyes. There was some dressing and some washing done at the landing place, not very much, hands and teeth. Then the whole crew pushed their way through the undergrowth to the hidden harbour at the south end of the island. There was their ship, moored as they'd left her. They paddled her out through the rocks, hoisted the damp brown sail, and sailed across to the landing place by the oak tree on the mainland. Here they pulled Swallow's nose well up on the beach and tied the painter round a big stone. Then they walked up to Dixon's farm. Mrs. Dixon said, "You'll be come for the milk. I see you've got your own can. They're at the milking now." She went off with the can and brought it back, bubbling and warm with new milk. "There it is," she said. "And mind now, if there's anything else you want, don't be afraid to come and ask for it." They sailed back to the landing place this time and not to the harbour. Then there was the fire to build and breakfast to cook. Mate Susan took charge of that, but the others were too hungry to go far from the fire while it was being got ready. After breakfast, while Mate Susan and able seaman Titty were busy in the camp, the captain and the boy sailed away to Holly Howe to pick up some extra supplies, fishing rods and their bathing things. The little Swallow rushed from one side of the lake to the other and back again, going about at the end of each tack with a shiver and flap of her brown sail. On one tack, John took her right into Houseboat Bay, close by the houseboat. The pirate was sitting on the after deck, sheltered from the wind by the cabin and the awning. The green parrot was perched on the railing and looked down on the Swallow while the wind ruffled the green feathers on his back. The retired pirate looked up for a moment as they passed. He stared at them, frowning as the Swallow swung round and headed out of the bay to pass on the northern side of the huge buoy to which the houseboat was moored. Just for one moment they had a good view of her bows, when they saw something that made the old blue launch that had been turned into a houseboat seem more pirate-like than ever. Roger saw it first. There could be no doubt about what it was. "He's got a cannon," said Roger. "Look!" On the foredeck of the houseboat, on the starboard side, its round, shiny nose poking out above the blue planking, was a brightly polished little brass cannon. Once upon a time, perhaps, it had been used for starting yacht races. Even for Captain John, it was proof that the houseboat was more than an ordinary houseboat. A brass cannon and a green parrot. At last they passed Darien and reached into Holly Howe Bay. They went up the field to the farm and collected their fishing rods and bathing things. Returning to the boat, they stowed their cargo, hoisted the sail, and were soon reaching out of the bay. This time, with the wind aft, and a good one, the Swallow fairly raced home to the island, with her wake creaming out astern of her. It was while they were beating home again that they discovered another island. It was on the western shore, not quite opposite their own island, but a little farther north. They made up their minds to tack a little farther up the lake to look at this new island. It was very small. There was nothing on it but rocks and heather and 2 dead trees. One of the trees had fallen, the other was still standing. Many of its branches were broken, and it had no leaves. But instead of leaves on the bare tree, there was something else. 3 dark birds with long necks were perched on its branches. "What are they?" said Roger. "Cormorants," said Captain John. As the Swallow sailed nearer, they saw one of the cormorants fly down to the water, followed by the others. "They're fishing," said Roger. "We'll call this island Cormorant Island, said Captain John. Next morning, the whole of Swallow's ship's company bathed before breakfast. The landing place, with its little beach on the eastern side of the island, was a good place for bathing. There was sand there, and though there were stones, they were not so sharp as elsewhere. Also, the water didn't go deep there very suddenly, and after Susan had walked out a good long way, she said that Roger might bathe too. After breakfast, the ship's company sat down to decide on the names for all the places on the island. There was Lookout Point, of course, under the tall tree. Then there were the landing place, the harbour, the western shore, and the camp. Then there were the places that could be seen from the island. There was Darien, Houseboat Bay, Dixon's Bay, and Cormorant Island. Far away to the south, there was the Antarctic. Far away to the north, beyond Rio, was the Arctic. The little town of Rio is known in guidebooks by another name, but the crew of the Swallow had long ago given it the name of Rio Grande. As for their own island, they couldn't agree on a name for it. They thought of Swallow Island, Walker Island, Big Tree Island, but they were bothered by the thought of the fireplace which they'd found there. Perhaps the island had a splendid name already. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning of their third day on the island. The ship's company were at the lookout place at the northern end of the island. Able Seaman Titty was lying on her stomach in the heather, looking through the telescope at the woody point that hid Houseboat Bay and the houseboat of the retired pirate. "It's still in there," she said. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and a puff of smoke showed above the woody point. Everybody jumped up. "I told you he had a cannon," said Roger. And just then, a small sailing boat with one sail shot out from behind the point. She was about the same size as Swallow, only with a white sail instead of a brown one. She was sailing close-hauled against a southwesterly wind. The little boat sailed right across the lake on the port tack and then came about and headed almost directly for the island. In the little boat were two girls, one steering, the other sitting on the middle thwart. The two were almost exactly alike. Both had red knitted caps, brown shirts, blue knickerbockers, and no stockings. They were steering straight for the island. "Lie down, everybody," said Captain John. "We don't know whether they're friends or enemies." Roger dropped flat. So did Titty. So did Susan. Captain John took the telescope and rested it on the edge of the rock so that he could see through it while his head was hidden by a clump of heather. "I can read her name," he said. Am, A-Z, as, O-N, on, Amazon. The little boat came nearer and nearer. The girl who was steering, they could see now that she was the bigger of the two, pulled something from under the stern sheets. The other reached aft to take it, and then went forward and was busy with something about the mast. Suddenly, the Amazon, now only 20 yards from the island, went about. They heard the girl who was steering say, "Ready about!" and saw the other duck to let the boom pass over. Then she stood up again at once, holding some halyards in her hands. She began to haul downwards, hand over hand, and a little flagstaff with a flag on it went bobbing and jerking up to the masthead. The little staff straightened itself at the top of the mast, and the flag, a three-cornered one, blew out in the wind. Titty. The little boat came nearer and nearer. The girl who was steering, they could see now that she was the bigger of the two, pulled something from under the stern sheets. The other reached aft to take it, and then went forward and was busy with something about the mast. Suddenly, the Amazon, now only 20 yards from the island, went about. They heard the girl who was steering say, "Ready about!" and saw the other duck to let the boom pass over. Then she stood up again at once, holding some halyards in her hands. She began to haul downwards, hand over hand, and a little flagstaff with a flag on it went bobbing and jerking up to the masthead. The little staff straightened itself at the top of the mast, and the flag, a three-cornered one, blew out in the wind. Titty drew a long breath that nearly choked her. The flag blowing out in the wind at the masthead of the little boat was black, and on it, in white, were a skull and 2 crossed bones. The 4 on the island stared at each other in silence. The Amazon went about once more and sailed round the southern end of the island. They watched her until the trees at that end of the island hid her. Sailing fast with the wind with them, they ran through between the island and the mainland and headed north, sailing on towards Houseboat Bay and Darien. "They must have hoisted the flag because they saw us," said John. "If they were pirates," said Titty, "why did the pirate on the houseboat fire at them?" "Perhaps he didn't," said Susan. "Watch if they run into Houseboat Bay again." "They haven't got a cannon," said Roger, "and he has, a beauty. I know it was the pirate on the houseboat who fired." The Amazon didn't run into Houseboat Bay. The little boat, with her white sail well out, held on her course, leaving a long line of wake astern her, as straight as if it had been laid off with a ruler. They watched the little white sail grow smaller until at last it disappeared beyond the peak of Darien. In the morning, John was the first to wake. It was already late. The sun was high overhead. The first days had gone by on which the beginning of the morning light had been enough to waken the explorers. They had grown used to sleeping in a tent. John looked at the lump of blanket on the other side of the tent and decided to let it sleep. He crawled out of his own blankets, dressed himself, and slipped out into the lonely sunlight. Taking the milk can with him, he ran through the trees to the harbour, put the milk can into Swallow, and pushed off. He rowed hard for the beach by the oak tree below Dixon's farm. "You're not so early this morning," said Mrs. Dixon when he arrived at the farm. "Mr. Turner of the houseboat has been asking about you. You haven't been meddling with his houseboat, have you?" "No," said John. "Well, he seems to think you have," said Mrs. Dixon. "You'd better leave Mr. Turner and his parrot alone." When he got back to the island, Captain John said, "I have grave news. Something has happened. I shall call a council as soon as we've had breakfast." "Aye, aye, sir," said the able seaman, and poked the boy, who said, "Aye, aye, sir." When breakfast was over, Captain John spoke. "I call a council," he said. They were all sitting round the fire, which was now burning low. The saucepan full of water was standing among the embers, keeping hot for washing up the stickier things. "We have an enemy," said Captain John. "Who is it?" said able seaman Titty eagerly. "You know the man on the houseboat," said Captain John. "He's been telling the natives that we have been meddling with his craft. But we never touched it. I know we haven't, but he's been telling them that we have. He's trying to set the natives against us. I don't know why he hates us, but he does." "He has a secret," said Titty. "They all have. Either it's dark deeds or else it's treasure. Look at the way he fired at the pirate ship. He must have thought they were after his hoard." "Yes, but why is he against us?" said John. "Perhaps this is his island," said Titty. "You know someone has been here before us and made a fireplace. But if it was his island, he could live on it instead of living on the houseboat. It'd be much more comfortable for the parrot," said Titty. "Anyway, it looks as if he wanted to get us turned off the island." "We won't go," said Roger. "Of course we won't, but the question is just what ought we to do?" "Let's go and sink the houseboat," said Roger. Just at that moment, something hit the saucepan with a loud ping, and ashes flew up out of the fire. A long arrow with a green feather stuck quivering among the embers. The 4 explorers started to their feet. Roger grabbed at the arrow and pulled it out of the fire. Titty took it from him at once. "It may be poisoned," she said. "Don't touch the point of it." "Listen," said Captain John. They listened. There was not a sound to be heard but the quiet lapping of the water against the western shore of the island. "It's him," said Titty. "He's winged his arrow with a feather from his green parrot." There was the sharp crack of a dead stick breaking, somewhere in the middle of the island. "We must scout," said Captain John. "I'll take one end of the line, the mate the other. Titty and Roger go in the middle. Spread out. As soon as one of us sees him, the others close in to help." They spread out across the island and began to move forward. But they'd not gone 10 yards when John gave a shout. "Swallow has gone!" he shouted. He was on the left of the line, and as soon as he came out of the camping ground, he saw the place where he'd left Swallow when he'd come back with the milk. The others ran towards the place. There was not a sign of Swallow. She had simply disappeared. "We'll comb the whole island," said John. "She can't have drifted away. He's taken her. But he's still on the island. We heard him. Advance as soon as the mate blows her whistle. A hoot like an owl means all right. 3 hoots means something's up. Blow as soon as you're ready, Mr. Mate." The mate crossed the island nearly to the western shore. She looked out through the trees. Not a sail was to be seen on the lake. Roger and Titty, 6 yards apart, were in the middle of the island. Captain John moved a little way inland, but not so far that anyone could be between him and the shore without being seen. They listened. There was not a sound. Then, over the western side of the island, the mate blew her whistle. The 4 began moving again through the trees and the undergrowth. "Roger," called Titty, "have you got a weapon?" "No," said Roger. "Have you?" "I've got 2 sticks, pikes, I mean. You better have one." She threw one of her sticks to Roger. An owl hooted away to her left. "That must be the captain," she said. She hooted back. Susan, away on the right, hooted in reply, and again they all listened. Then they moved forward again. "Hello," said Roger. "Someone's been here." Titty ran to him. There was a round place where the grass and ferns were pressed flat, as if someone had been lying there. Titty hooted like an owl 3 times. The captain and the mate came running. Captain John bent down and felt the flattened grass with his hand. "Spread out again and go on," he said. "We mustn't let him get away with Swallow. He can't be far away because we heard him. If he had taken Swallow to sea, we should have seen her. He must have her here somewhere, close along the shore." At that moment there was a wild yell. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" But the yelling did not come from in front of them. It came from behind them, from the direction of the camp. "Come on," said Captain John. "Keep together. Charge!" The whole party rushed back through the trees towards the camp. Just as they came to the edge of the clearing, there was a shout, but they could see no one. "Hands up! Halt!" The voice came from immediately in front of them. "Hands up!" it came again. "Flat on your faces!" cried Captain John, throwing himself on the ground. Susan, Titty, and Roger were full length on the ground in a moment. An arrow passed harmlessly over their heads. In the middle of the camp, a tall stick was stuck in the ground with a black pirate flag blowing from the top of it. Then, inside their own tents, they saw 2 figures, kneeling, one with a bow ready to shoot, the other fitting an arrow. "It's not the houseboat man," said Titty. "It's the pirates from the pirate ship." "And in our tents," said Susan. "Let's take them prisoners," said Roger. The 4 swallows were up and halfway across the open space in a moment. The red-capped Amazons leapt up out of the tents to meet them. The 4 explorers of the Swallow stood facing the 2 pirates from the Amazon. The Amazons were bigger than most of the swallows. One of them was bigger than Captain John. The other was about the same size. If it had come to a fight, it might have been a very near thing. But it did not come to a fight. "Let's parley first and fight afterwards," said the leader of the Amazons. "It's no good our parleying with you if the houseboat man has got Swallow," said John. "The man from the houseboat?" said the younger Amazon. "But he's got nothing to do with it. He's a native and very unfriendly." "Well, he's unfriendly to us too," said John. Susan pulled John by the sleeve. "If the houseboat man isn't with them," she whispered, "they must have taken Swallow themselves, and the only place they could put her is the harbour. Their own ship must be there too, so if they have got our tents, we can take both ships." "Where is Swallow?" said Captain John. "She's a prize, and we've taken her into our harbour." "It's our harbour," said John. "And anyhow, that's not much good to you. You can't get out from this end of the island against the four of us. The harbour end of the island is in our hands, so that really it's the Amazon that's the prize, and we've got both ships. You've only got our tents." Titty spoke. "Why have your arrows got green feathers? The pirate on the houseboat must have given them to you. You must be on his side." The younger Amazon exclaimed, "But the green feathers are our trophies. We took them ourselves. He was keeping them to clean his pipes, and we boarded his ship and took them." The elder Amazon said, "We're all on the same side, and I don't see the good of fighting." John said, "But why did you come to our island?" "Our island," said the Amazons together. "How can it be your island? This is our camp." "It's been our island for years and years," said the Amazons. "Who built the fireplace? Who marked the harbour?" "You mean putting the cross on the tree?" said John. The elder Amazon laughed. "That just shows it's our island," she said. "You don't even know how the harbour's marked." "We do," said Roger. John was silent. He knew that they did not. At last he said, "Right, we'll parley, but you must put down your weapons, and so will we." The Amazons put their bows on the ground. Roger and Titty put down their pikes. Captain John walked towards the Amazons and held out his hand. "My name is John Walker," he said, "master of the ship Swallow. This is Susan Walker, mate of the Swallow. This is Titty, able seaman, and this is Roger, ship's boy." The elder Amazon shook hands with him. "I'm Nancy Blackett, master and part owner of the Amazon, the terror of the seas. This is Peggy Blackett, mate and part owner of the same." "Her real name isn't Nancy," said Peggy. "Her name is Ruth, but Uncle Jim said that Amazons were ruthless, and as our ship is the Amazon, and we are Amazon pirates from the Amazon River, we had to change her name. Uncle Jim gave us the ship last year. We only had a rowing boat before that. Uncle Jim is the man on the houseboat." "If he's your uncle, you must be in league with him," said Titty. "We jolly well aren't," said Nancy. "He was friendly last year. This year he's worse than the natives." They all sat down, and Nancy said, "When did you first come to this island?" "We've been on the island for days and days." "Well," said Nancy, "we were born on the shores of the Amazon River, which flows into this ocean. We have been coming to this island for years and years." "We used to come in a rowing galley until Uncle Jim gave us the Amazon," said Peggy. "We've made our camp here every year." "Look here," said Nancy. "What is the name of this island?" We haven't given it a name yet," said John. "It's called Wild Cat Island. Uncle Jim called it that because it belonged to us. That shows you whose island it is." "But it's our island now," said John. "It was uninhabited when we came, and we put our tents up here, and you can't turn us out." Titty broke in. "Is your Uncle Jim a retired pirate?" she asked. "I said he was as soon as we saw him." Nancy thought for a moment. "It's quite a good thing for him to be," she said at last. "But," said Titty, "you are pirates too." "That's why he hates us," said Nancy. "He must be Captain Flint. He knows what pirates are. He knows the day will come when he will walk the plank off the deck of his own ship when we've captured it." "We'll help," said Roger. "He hates us," said Captain John. "He's been stirring up the natives against us." "Let's be allies," said Nancy. "Then it won't matter who the island belongs to. We will be allies against Captain Flint and all the natives in the world." "Really, we wanted to be allies as soon as we saw your smoke on the island yesterday," said Peggy. "We're sick of natives. We wanted to be allies at once, if only we hadn't promised to be home for lunch. That was why we just sailed round the island and defied you with our flag. We came here today to look at you again. There was no smoke, and we thought you'd gone. Probably you were all asleep. Then we saw your ship at the landing place. Then we sailed round into the harbour, and we came through the bush on the island scouting, and we saw you round your campfire. Then we sailed back round to the landing place and took away your ship and put her in the harbour. Then we came back and made our surprise attack. When you found your ship was gone and you all ran down to the landing place, we slipped past and took the camp." "Avast there, Peggy, you goat," said Nancy. "Excuse my mate," she said to Captain John. "She does chatter so." My idea is an alliance against all enemies, especially Uncle Jim. Captain Flint, I mean. But we want the sort of alliance that will let us fight each other if we want to." "Right," said Captain John. The two captains shook hands. "Uncle Jim's been all over the world," said Peggy. "Mother's his sister, you know. Last year he came home and he said he'd gathered enough moss and meant to settle down. He said he was going to write a book, and all through the summer he's been living in the houseboat. Instead of sailing with us, he's in league with the natives. We've done everything we could to wake him up, but it's no good. It ended by his forbidding us to come near him. That's why we watched till he went ashore and boarded his ship and took the green feathers for our arrows," said Nancy, "just to show him." "Did he really fire at you yesterday?" asked Captain John. "That wasn't him. That was us," said Captain Nancy. "We sailed into the bay and round the houseboat and looked in through the cabin windows. Uncle, Captain Flint, was asleep. We saw him. So we took one of those big Roman candles that fizz and then go off with a bang, and we put it on the cabin roof and lit it and sailed away. We were just clearing the point when it banged. We'd saved it from last 5th of November. "Did he see you?" asked Captain John. "I don't think so," said Captain Nancy. "I wonder," said Captain John. "I wonder if he thought it was us." "Well, we're all at war with him now," said Captain Nancy. "One day we'll capture the houseboat and make him walk the plank. But we can't fight Captain Flint all the time, so we must practice. It'll be very good practice for us to try to capture the Swallow and for you to try to capture the Amazon. The one who wins shall be flagship. There's always a flagship in a fleet. If you capture Amazon, then Swallow will be flagship and Captain John will be Commodore. If we capture Swallow, then Amazon will be flagship and I'll be Commodore, beginning from tomorrow." "And when that's settled, we'll go and take the houseboat," said Titty. "But," said John, "you know where we keep Swallow because you know we're here. If we don't guard her, you can easily take her. But we don't know where you keep Amazon." "If you sail southwest," said Nancy, "you'll come to a promontory. If you go beyond that promontory, you'll find the mouth of a river. That's the Amazon River. Not far up it, on the right bank, there's a boathouse. It's a stone boathouse with a big wooden skull and crossbones that we made fastened over the front of it. In it, there's a motor launch that you mustn't touch because it belongs to the natives, and there's a rowing boat, and also Amazon when she's at home. Now you know." "Half a minute," said John. "I've got a chart here." Nancy Blackett showed him the River Amazon on the chart. John gave her a pencil and said, "You mark where the boathouse is." Captain Nancy made a mark with a pencil in the right place. "It'll be a cutting-out expedition only," she said. "It's agreed that whoever wins is to be as careful with the other boat as with their own." "Agreed," said Captain John. "Now, look here, Captain Nancy, I wish you'd tell me about the markings of the harbour." "It's quite simple, Captain John," said Nancy. "Come along and I'll show you while our tars are rigging the meal." They walked together to the harbour. When they got there, Captain John went straight to the stump of the tree with the cross on it. "I found this at once," he said. "And you didn't find anything else," said Nancy. "That's because we are Amazon pirates and keep our marks secret. One of them's no good without the other, and the other isn't marked at all." Nancy squatted on the beach and drew a half circle. "Suppose this is the harbour," she said, "and these are the rocks outside." She put some big stones in about the position of the rocks outside the harbour. "You want to come in. Well, a straight line like that brings you clean through the rocks without touching any of them. Draw the line a bit longer, right into the harbour and up on the beach. Your marks must be on that line. Take this for your first mark." She planted a twig. "That's the tree stump with the cross on it. Now, you find anything else that you can see over the first mark and also on the same straight line. It can be anything. There's no need to mark it if you know it. Then, when you want to come into the harbour from the outside, all you have to do is to keep the two marks, one behind the other. So long as you do that, you'll be on the straight line that brings you safe between the rocks. Hop into Amazon. I'll take her out and show you." John stepped into Amazon. Nancy shoved off and took her right outside the rocks so that they were in the open sea. Then Sculling with an oar over the stern, she brought her round so that she was headed straight towards the island. "Now," she said, "do you see the stump with the cross on it?" "Yes," said John. "Look above it to the right, and you'll see the fork of a tree with a big patch of bark off it below the fork. Got it?" "Yes." "That's the other mark. As it is now, there are rocks between us and the harbour. But if I bring her up a bit, you'll see the fork of the tree come nearer to the marked stump until it's exactly over it. Then we can go straight in. Sing out as soon as the two are in a straight line." "They're in a straight line now," said Captain John. "Right," said Captain Nancy. "You watch those two marks and tell me the moment they are not one above another." She began sculling fast over the stern, and the Amazon moved in towards the rocks. "The fork is to the right of the stump," sang out John. Nancy sculled away, slightly altering her direction. "How is it now?" she said. "In line." She went on sculling. The Amazon moved on between the rocks and came at last into the harbour. "We're through," said John. "That was jolly good work." "It's quite simple," said Nancy. They pulled up the Amazon and went back to the camp. Time went fast as the 6 mariners sat around the fire planning voyages. At last Captain Nancy looked up at the sun. "We'd better be sailing," she said, "or there'll be more trouble with the natives. We've been late for supper twice this week already. This wind always goes and drops about sunset, and it's a tremendous way to row. Stir your stumps, Peggy." The whole crew of the Swallow went down to the harbour to see the Amazons off. The Amazons worked out of harbour, set their sail, and with the fair wind that was still blowing, were soon slipping past the northern end of the island. The Swallows had run back to the lookout place to wave to them. "War beginning tomorrow," shouted Captain Nancy. "All right," shouted Captain John. Soon after the Amazon's little white sail had vanished beyond the peak of Darien, Captain John took the hammer and a few nails and the 2 candle lanterns and went to the harbour with mate Susan to help him. "You know what they said about the harbour being marked," said John, showing Susan the stump with the white cross on it. "Well, this is one of the marks, and the other is that tree with the fork in it and a bit of bark gone just below the fork. Those Amazons can come into the harbour without bothering about the rocks by keeping those 2 in line. But in a real harbour, there are lights on marks like that so that ships can find their way in the dark. I'm going to make the marks into leading lights so that we can make a night attack on the Amazon and then find our way back however dark it is." He drove a nail into the middle of the white cross on the stump and hung one of the lanterns on it. Then he and Susan went to the foot of the forked tree. The fork was high above their reach. "Are you going to climb up and put the lantern in the fork?" asked Susan. "No, Mr. Mate. It's no good doing that, for then only you and I will be able to climb up and light it. We must have it somewhere where we can all light it. But if we make it too low, it'll be no good. You go down to the harbour and stand behind the stump as near to the water as you can go." Susan went back and stood behind the stump, which was about 10 yards from the water's edge. She stood on the edge of the water. "Can you see the fork of the tree?" John called out to her. "Yes," said Susan. He put his hand on the trunk of the forked tree as high up as he could reach. "Can you see my hand?" "Yes." "Can you still see it?" He moved his hand slowly down the trunk of the tree. "Now I can't," said Susan. He raised it a few inches. "I can see it now," said Susan. He drove a nail in just above the place where his hand had been. Then he hung the second lantern on it. As soon as it began to grow dark, the whole crew of Swallow were at the harbour again. John gave the able seaman the matches, and she lit both lanterns. Then all 4 of them embarked. They rowed away down the lake. The dark came fast overhead. Stars shone out. Owls were calling. The edges of the lake disappeared under the hills. They could see the outlines of the hills, great black masses pressing up into the starry sky. "Now all hands keep a lookout and sing out, anybody, as soon as our lanterns show," said Captain John. A minute or two later, Titty saw them, flickering among the trees and then disappearing again as they were hidden by the big rocks south of the island. John paddled slowly on. "There they are again," said Susan. "Close together," said Titty. John turned round from his rowing and had a good look at the two small stars twinkling over the water. "Right," he said. "Now I'm going to do nothing but row if you'll keep your eyes on the lights. Are they still close together?" "Fairly close," said Susan. "Where's the top light?" asked Captain John. "A bit to the left of the low one," said Susan. John pulled a stroke or two, pulling a little harder with his right. "Sing out as soon as it's just above it." "It's above it now." "Now it's a bit to the right of it." John pulled his left. "Above it." John rowed on. Mate Susan, able seaman Titty, and the boy Roger watched the lights and sang out the moment the top one showed a little to left or right of the lower one. At last John just grazed a rock with his starboard oar. "We must be close in now," he said. "The lights are exactly one above another," said Susan. John had shipped his oars and was now sculling over the stern. The boat moved on in the darkness. "The lights are quite close to us," said Roger, and as he said it, there was a gentle scrunch as the Swallow's nose touched the soft, pebbly beach of the little harbour. Captain John had used his leading lights for the first time and had made his harbour in pitch dark. "This is going to win us the war with the Amazons," he said with great delight. "It's the one thing they think we can't do, and we can." They scrambled ashore and unhooked the lanterns from the nails, moored Swallow by lantern light, and by lantern light found their way through the brambles and bushes back to the camp. The first thing John did when he woke in the morning was to listen. He could hear Roger's breathing somewhere in the blankets on the other sleeping bag. He could hear a wren quarrelling with some other bird on the island. But he could not hear any rustling of leaves. He could not hear any noise of water on the shores. It was a day of absolute calm. He rolled over and looked at the barometer. It had hardly moved. No, it was a perfectly calm day, and the Swallows and Amazons were held apart by long miles of windless, useless water. Before the others were up, he rowed across to the mainland to fetch the milk for their breakfast. This time Mr. Dixon, the farmer, was in the kitchen with Mrs. Dixon. "I hear you've had visitors," said Mr. Dixon. "Yes," said John shortly. He didn't feel like discussing their affairs with a native. "Shall he be seeing those lasses again?" asked Mr. Dixon. "Yes," said John, "as soon as ever there's a wind for sailing." "Well," said Mr. Dixon, "you tell them to tell their Uncle Jim to put a good padlock on that houseboat of his if he leaves it at nights. Down in the pub at Bigland yonder, there was a deal too much talk going on about that houseboat and what he has in it. Nobody in these parts would touch it, but when talk gets going as far as Bigland, you never know who hears it. There's more than plenty of wild young lads that are up to anything without thinking twice." John returned to the island, and after breakfast he called a council for the second time. "It's about Captain Flint again," he said. He told them about the message Mr. Dixon had given him. When he'd finished, he said, "You see, there's no wind. We shan't see the Amazons today, so we can't give them the message. That means the houseboat man, Captain Flint," said Titty, "Captain Flint won't know what Mr. Dixon, the native, wanted him to know. Do you think we ought to tell him without waiting for the Amazons? It's all native business. It's got nothing to do with us, really, even if he is a beast and thinks we've been touching his houseboat. But all the same, it wouldn't do not to tell him. We were to have told the Amazons. They're not here, so we ought to tell him ourselves. I'm going over now to tell him myself. All agreed?" They all agreed. And so it happened that for the second time that day, Captain John took the masted sail out of Swallow and set out across the lake. He didn't like going because he was worried about what the Amazons would think, and after all, it was their message. Also, he didn't like going to deliver a message to an enemy who had stirred up the natives against them so unjustly. Still, there was the message, a native message. It would be more uncomfortable not to deliver it than to deliver it. It didn't take him long to reach the southern point of Houseboat Bay. He rounded it and plugged away at the oars, navy stroke, not hurrying but keeping his timing as regular as a clock. Suddenly he heard the squawk of a parrot and a shout quite close to him. "What are you up to?" He was a dozen yards or so from the houseboat. Captain Flint was on deck, lowering a large suitcase into a rowing boat that lay alongside. In the bows of the rowing boat was a large cage with the green parrot in it. The houseboat man, in very towny clothes, was lowering his suitcase into the stern. A motor car was waiting on the road which ran close to the shore at the head of the little bay. It was clear that the parrot and the houseboat man were presently going away. John was just going to say good morning or something like that, but the houseboat man spoke first. "Look here," he said. "You leave my houseboat alone. Once is quite enough. Just you lay to your oars and clear out, fast, and don't come here again. Yes, and if you've any more of those fireworks, the best thing you can do with them is to drop them in the lake. How would you like someone to come and let off a firework in your boat and set fire to the sail or something? Look at the mess you've made of my cabin roof." There was a large burnt patch on top of the curved cabin roof. The houseboat man pointed to it indignantly. "But I never had any fireworks," said John. "At least, not since last November." "That won't do," said the houseboat man. "I've seen you round here several times in the past few days." "But I've never been near your boat before, never as near as I am now." "Listen," said the houseboat man. "When you came and lit that beastly thing that made such a mess of my cabin roof, you cleared off round the point. I came up and put the fire out and guessed at once what you'd done." "But I didn't set fire to your boat," said John. "Who did set fire to her then?" said the houseboat man. "Who else would have done such a thing?" John said nothing. It would never do to give the Amazons away. "Now clear out," said the houseboat man. "I've nothing more to say to you." "But I came to tell you—" "Clear out. I don't like talking to liars." John went very red. Then he rowed away without a word. The ship's crew spent that evening round the campfire making their plans. There would surely be a wind in the morning, but who could tell which way it might blow? A southerly wind would mean one plan, and a northerly wind another. A northerly would make it easy for the Amazons to sail to Wildcat Island. A southerly would make it easy for the Swallows to sail to the Amazon River. Getting back mattered less. It wouldn't matter how long that took. "In naval warfare," said John, remembering a well-known book, "two things are important. To know exactly what you want to do, and to do it in the manner that your enemy least expects." The Swallows would sail on at dusk into the river, find the boathouse, cut out the Amazon, put aboard a prize crew, Susan, to sail her back, and return to Wildcat Island in the dark. The leading lights will be lit to make it safe to bring the ships into the harbour in the dark. But candles will not burn all day, so someone had to stay on the island to light them at the last minute. That someone was to be Titty. So, that was settled. The only question was, would there be a wind, and which way would it blow? In the morning, there was a fog on the lake. They couldn't see the mainland from the island. But after breakfast, a little ripple showed on the water under the fog. The fog moved and drifted through the trees and began to lift from the lake. Now here, now there, the masses of the hills and the dark patches of the woods on the shores showed through the mist, disappeared, and showed again. The wind was southerly. It brought with it a light drizzle, but that passed, and then the fog was gone. The wind strengthened, and the sun shone. "We must make everything ready to set sail at about 4 o'clock, said Captain John. "Able Seaman Titty, it's no good lighting the candle lanterns on the harbour marks until we are close to. Besides, you'll want them in the camp. You better not put them on the marks until you hear us give the owl call. Then you'll know it's us and not an enemy. I say, Titty, do you really think you can manage all by yourself? Of course I can, but I hope they don't slip past you in the islands. I couldn't manage both the Amazons by myself. At 4 o'clock, Captain John took a last look over the ship. All aboard, he said, and the mate and the boy climbed in and went to the stern. The captain pushed, and as the Swallow floated off, he set a knee on her bows, and a moment later was busy with the sail. You won't forget about the lights, Titty, he called. Everything may depend on them if it's very dark. When you hear us make owl calls, light the candle lanterns on the harbour marks. Aye, aye, sir, said Titty. Swallows forever! She watched them through the telescope until the brown sail disappeared behind the peak of Darien. She then became Robinson Crusoe and went down into the camp to take command of her island. The fair wind brought them fast from Wildcat Island down to Rio Bay. They cruised in and out among the islands and made sure that the Amazons were not lurking among them. Then they anchored close under one of the islands north of Rio to wait till dusk. Now at last the sun had set. Twilight was coming on. There was no wind, for the wind had gone with the sun as it so often does. All was astir in the Swallow. The mast was unstepped and laid on the thwarts so that it stuck out over the bows. Roger rowed. John was looking at the chart. Susan steered. Slowly they moved across to the western shore. Already the hills were dark and you couldn't see the woods on them. Here and there on the shores of the lake, lights twinkled in the houses of the natives. The Swallow drifted on past the point. They were in smooth water now, sheltered by the high ground of the promontory. Susan steered till she could see the lights of a house reflected in the river. That was the opening in the reeds. She steered towards it. Presently, there were tall reeds on either side of them. They were in the Amazon River. The boathouse is somewhere on the right bank, whispered John. That's our left. Tell Roger to keep a lookout to port. There was a whisper from the lookout. There it is. I see it. High above the reeds, not far ahead of them, on the right bank of the river, rose the black, square shape of a large building. That's it, whispered the captain. The boathouse stood deep in an inlet among the reeds. There was a dead silence on the river as the Swallow drifted on. There was a noise of music in the house with the lights in it. Captain Nancy said the boathouse had a skull and crossbones on it, whispered Captain John. I see it, cried Roger. Shut up, hissed the mate. On the front of the big open boathouse, high up over the entrance, cut out of wood and painted staring white, were a huge skull and crossbones big enough to have belonged to an elephant. Can you see in? Asked Captain John. There's a big boat in there, said Roger. They said there would be. That'll be the launch that belongs to the natives. Gently now, gently. Swallow slid into the big dark boathouse. Look out, don't bump the launch, whispered Susan. There's nothing else, said Roger. The Amazon isn't here. John was standing in the stern of the Swallow, holding on to the gunwale of the launch. He pulled out his pocket torch. The bright light wavered round the boathouse. It showed a rowing skiff and the big launch, and an empty space on the farther side. It was clear that a boat was usually moored there. Pinned to the wooden stage that ran along that wall of the boathouse was a big envelope, white in the light of the torch. Captain John pushed at the launch and Swallow moved across towards the wall. The captain examined the envelope by the light of the torch. There was a skull and crossbones on it, done in red pencil. Under that, in blue pencil, was written, "To the Swallows." John tore the envelope open. Inside there was a sheet of paper with another skull and crossbones done in blue. Under them, in red, were the words, "Ha, ha." And under them, the Amazon pirates, and two names, Nancy Blackett, captain, and Peggy Blackett, mate. At the same moment that the swallows were reading the note from the Amazons, there was a splash in the deep reed beds at the river's mouth. The nose of a boat pushed its way out from among the reeds. Just above the nose of the boat was the head of Captain Nancy Blackett. She watched for a moment and listened. "All clear," she said. "They've gone upriver. That'll give us a bit more start. Come on." There was more splashing in the reeds as Peggy Blackett poled over the stern. The boat came out of the reeds into the mouth of the river and drifted out towards the lake. Captain Nancy took the oars. She rowed hard for a minute or two. "Safe enough now," she said. "I'm going to step the mast. It's lucky we thought of taking it down, or they'd have seen it over the reeds. Hang on to the main sheet, you son of a sea cook," she said with great good temper and satisfaction. She hoisted the sail. "Now then, me hearties," she said as she clambered aft. "Wildcat Island and Amazons forever. We've done them fairly brown." Before it was too dark to see what she was doing without a torch, Titty took one of the candle lanterns and hooked it up on the nail on the forked tree. It would be easier to open it and light it up there than to light it and feel round for the nail to hang it on. Then she went back to the camp. She made up the fire, lit the other candle lantern, and tried to read by it. But reading wasn't easy, even with the candle lantern, because of the fire leaping up and flashing shadows across the pages. Then she remembered that there was only a very short piece of candle in the lantern, and it would be wanted at the harbour. She blew it out. She took both her blankets from the tent, rolled herself up in one of them, and made a hood and cloak of the other. Then she sat, watching her fire, with the electric torch and the candle lantern close beside her. That was the last thing she remembered. She was wakened with the wind in her face and the long call of an owl. She sat up suddenly. Where was she? The fire had died down to red embers. It was very dark. How long ago was it that she'd heard that owl? Was it before she fell asleep, or just now, or was it an owl heard in a dream? John and Susan and Roger must be sailing about in the dark with the two ships, wondering why the lights were not lit. She scrambled to her feet and listened. For a moment she could hear nothing, and then, somewhere on the lake, there was the creak of a boom swinging over as a boat went about. She felt about on the ground for the torch. She found it, and the lantern close beside it. She lit the torch and ran out of the camp and hurried, stumbling as she went, along the path to the harbour. She found the forked tree and took out her box of matches. Her first match blew out, and her second as she lifted it up to light the lantern, but the third match did it. She lit the other lantern easily and hung it on its nail on the stump with the white cross. Suddenly, a big owl flew by close over her head, between the two leading lights, puzzled by the glitter of them. She heard it as it swung away into the darkness. Perhaps it had not been the owl's signal she'd heard. Perhaps all her fears were for nothing, and Swallow was still far away, and yet that creak had sounded very like Swallow's boom going over. But just then, somewhere in the darkness in front of her, outside the harbour, she heard the noise of a sail coming down into a boat, and then the quick creak, creak that an oar makes when it's being used for sculling over the stern. She was just going to call out joyfully to welcome the swallows when she heard a voice that was not John's or Susan's or Roger's. The voice said, "Jolly good idea of theirs, putting lights on the marks." For one moment, Titty thought of blowing the lights out, but it was too late. The boat was close in. In another second, it grounded in the harbour, not 6 yards away. Titty crouched down on the ground behind a rock. Why had she ever gone to sleep? It was a real owl she'd heard, and not the signal from the swallows. And now, left on guard, she had lighted the Amazons into the harbour, and the swallows would come back to find the island in the hands of the enemy. Nancy Blackett was on the beach. "What beats me," she was saying, "is however they managed to get here before us. I'm sure I heard them go up the river. They must have rowed like smoke. They couldn't do it sailing. And I would never have thought they could do it rowing, even though we were beating all the way. Come on, Peggy, step lively, show a light." There was a flicker in the boat, and a moment later, Peggy was coming ashore with a lantern in her hand. "Why aren't they here?" she said. "They just lit the lights for us and scooted back to camp," said Captain Nancy, "pretending they'd been back for hours. Come along, let's have the lantern." The Amazon pirates passed so close to Able Seaman Titty that they could almost have touched her. They hurried on into the path. Their steps sounded farther and farther away. Then there was silence, except for the wind in the leaves. Titty did not know what to do. It was defeat, black and dreadful. The swallows had not captured the Amazon, but the Amazons had landed on Wildcat Island, and their pirate ship was snug in the harbour. If only she had not lit the lights! They could never have come in till dawn, and by then the swallows would be back. Just then, Titty had an idea. After all, it didn't matter who of the swallows captured the Amazon, and here was the Amazon, unprotected. Why not? In a moment, Titty was up and on the beach, and a moment later she was afloat, clawing the Amazon stern first out of harbour along the edge of the big rocks. Then she pulled out her torch and lit it for just long enough to find the oars. She stood in the stern of the Amazon to row, keeping her eyes on the 2 lights she had lit herself. She remembered that whatever happened, she must keep the 2 lights in line, one above another. She went on rowing backwards for a bit to be sure she was clear. She pulled hard with her left and brought Amazon's head nearer to the wind. Then she rowed steadily. It was very hard work. She couldn't keep on rowing like that all night. The best thing she could do would be to anchor in as safe a place as possible. She didn't want to be anchored anywhere near the island when dawn came. Who knew how well these pirates could swim? The other side of the lake would be safe. Suddenly she heard the splash of water on rocks quite close to her. It would never do to run Amazon ashore in the dark. She stopped rowing, scrambled forward, and lowered the anchor over the bows, letting out the rope hand over hand. Down it went, yard after yard. Deep water, after all. Then it stopped being heavy. The anchor was on the ground. She let the rest of the rope go. The Amazon drifted back and brought up with a light jerk. She found a rug and wrapped herself up in it, for it was cold enough on the water now that she was not rowing. She also found a big hunk of chocolate. This she ate. She settled herself in the bottom of the boat, just aft of the centreboard case, so as to keep warm and get some shelter from the wind. She'd begun to wonder how many hours it would be till dawn, when she stiffened suddenly, like a rabbit that has seen a man in a field. She heard a new noise. It was the noise of rowing, hard, fast rowing, the noise of 2 pairs of oars in a native boat, and the slap, slap of a boat's bows into the short waves. She knew that noise well. It came nearer and nearer. It passed close by her. She could hear the splash of the oars so clearly that she almost thought she could see the boat in the dark. These were not swallows or Amazons, but natives. And what could they be doing in the middle of the night when everybody, except, of course, pirates and explorers, ought to be asleep? "We must be near it now." A man's voice, loud in the wind, came to her out of the darkness. "Not yet. It must be another 100 yards at least. I can hear something. I bet it's not far now. Go a bit easier." There was a crash somewhere close ahead. "Told you, you blame fool. You've bloomin' well smashed the bloomin' boat. Get out and pull her up then. Take your hat off the lamp and let's have a bit of light." There was a splash, and then the noise of a boat being pulled up over stones. Then there was a glimmer and a flash of a bicycle lamp. "Boat's all right. Lost a bit of paint, that's all." "Give us a hand with a box, then. Nobody'll look for it here." "They will if you keep flashing that lamp about. Much better take it with us." "We can't carry that thing on a motor bicycle. Have to bring a car for it." "Blast it. Why didn't you bring a chisel to smash it open?" "It'll take more than a chisel to get that open." There was a noise of scrambling on stones, some curses, and then the noise of heavy stones being thrown down on something made of wood and metal. Then voices again. "Nobody'll find it now, even if they do come looking. Shove her off now and put your back into it. We've got to be far out of this before anyone's stirring. The noise of rowing began again. This time it grew rapidly fainter. They didn't sound at all like friendly natives, thought Titty to herself. She listened till she could hear no more, staring into the darkness. Her eyes closed once or twice. She tried to keep them open with her fingers. "I'm going to sleep again," she said. "I know I am." She was right. After searching fruitlessly for the Amazon for over an hour, the crew of the Swallow finally gave up and admitted defeat. It was now completely dark, and with no lights of any kind to guide them, they realized they couldn't possibly make Wildcat Island till morning. They spent the night moored to a small landing stage on one of the smaller islands at the northern end of Rio Bay. As soon as daylight came, they sailed out into the open lake beyond the islands, across to the farther side. "Hello," said John. "There's a boat." "What? It's the Amazon!" "Where?" said Susan. "Over there, starboard bow, by Cormorant Island. We shall fetch her on this tack." "It's Amazon, all right," said Susan, "but there's nobody in her. She must have broken loose from somewhere and drifted away." John watched carefully. "She's not drifting," he said. "She's at anchor. Perhaps the Amazons are asleep in her. Let's capture her after all. We'll get her anchor without waking them and tow her into harbour. Then when they wake, they'll be our prisoners." "I don't believe there's anybody in her," said Susan. "Rubbish," said John. "She couldn't have got there and anchored herself." "Well, we'll see in a minute," said Susan. They moved towards the little anchored ship. Suddenly, a hand showed on the gunwale, and a moment later, just as they were passing under Amazon's stern, the white face and rather draggled hair of able seaman Titty appeared over the transom. Able seaman Titty had thought out the proper thing to say, something about report, capture, enemies, and prize. But the words went out of her head at the last minute, and all she actually said was, "I've got her." Captain John let loose a hurrah that startled even himself. "Titty! Titty, however did you do it?" he said. "And where are the Amazons?" said Susan. "They've got our camp. They've got Wildcat Island," said Titty. "I couldn't help it. I was asleep, and there was an owl, and I thought it was you, and I lit the lights, and they came into harbour. Then they went to the camp, and I took Amazon." "Who cares about the camp?" cried John. "It was whoever could capture the other ship, and now we've got her, and I thought we'd failed. Swallow is flagship after all. Well done, Titty." Titty tried to tell her story, how she had pushed out in the dark, how she'd tried to anchor near the opposite shore, and had found only when day came that she'd anchored by Cormorant Island instead. Owls, the noise of rowing, men quarrelling, it all seemed a muddle. "The main thing," said Captain John, "is that Amazon is our prize. Now we'll sail over with the whole fleet. We'll make a landing in the face of the enemy and retake the island, or we'll call upon them to surrender. And if they won't, we'll keep to sea for days and days until they starve. But they'll have to give in." "Hello? What are they doing?" On the island, a large blanket, flapping heavily in the wind, was being slowly hoisted up by the big pine tree. "It's a white flag," said Titty. "They're surrendering." "We'll soon find out," said Captain John. "Roger stays with Susan in Swallow. Titty sails in Amazon. Look out, Titty. I'm coming aboard." He climbed from one boat into the other. Amazon's sail was a standing lug, just the same as Swallow's, so that John had no trouble in setting it. He began hauling in the anchor rope. "Now then, able seaman, will you take the tiller to sail her across? She's your prize, really, you know." "Are you ready, Mr. Mate?" "Ready," said Susan. Titty let go of Swallow's painter. Roger hauled it in, hand over hand, and coiled it down. Swallow's sail filled, and she began to move. John hauled on the Amazon's anchor rope till it was straight up and down. "Ready, Titty? Ready? Keep her full." In the fresh morning wind, the fleet moved towards Wildcat Island, Swallow a little ahead. The Amazons were waiting on the beach. They seemed altogether friendly. Peggy pulled Swallow up, and Nancy did the same for Amazon. But Captain John was taking no risks. "Captain Nancy," he said, "which ship is flagship?" Captain Nancy did not hesitate. "Swallow is, and earned it. But do buck up. No one knows we are here. We're supposed to be in bed, and we must get home in time to get up for breakfast when we are called." "You'll never do it," said Captain John. "Yes, we will. The wind's getting stronger every minute, and the sun's only just rising." Titty climbed out over Amazon's bows, and Captain Nancy shook her by the hand and slapped her on the back. "By thunder, able seaman," said she, "I wish you were in my crew. This morning, when I saw that you'd done us all by yourself, I could have swallowed the anchor. You did just exactly what we had planned to do." Susan was unloading the blankets and things from Swallow. Roger had run off to the camp. Everybody else took something to carry. Roger came running back. "They've got a grand fire," he said, "and the kettle's boiling over." "Who's for tea?" said Mate Susan. "Well, there's hardly time," said Peggy. "Come on, quick," said Nancy. "There's lots that's got to be said, and we can slop the tea down while we're saying it." The Swallows and the Amazons trooped along the path to the camp. The Amazons did most of the talking. "The real thing is," said Captain Nancy, "that we've got leave to come and camp on the island for a few days beginning tomorrow. We can't very well be at war with each other while we're living in the same camp. Yours was a great plan, by the way. Anybody might have been taken in by it. When we saw you at the boathouse—" "Where were you?" asked Captain John. "We were in the reeds at the mouth of the river." "I never thought of that," said Captain John. "We were sure you were all aboard," said Captain Nancy. "We knew you'd find nothing, and I thought we should have time to get down to Wildcat Island before it was quite dark. I thought you'd be going back there at once, but I never thought of your leaving a shore party and going up the river simply to trick us into our own trap. It really was a great plan." "But it wasn't a plan, really," said Captain John. "At least, I never thought of it. But what were you going to do?" "Our plan was very simple," said Captain Nancy. "We were going to sail to Wildcat Island. My mate was to put me ashore there and sail on and wait in the next bay. I was going to hide, and then, when you came back and went to the camp, I was going to collar Swallow and go off to look for Peggy and the rest of the fleet." "What did happen?" said Susan. "It took us much longer to get here than I'd thought it would. It got dark so quickly, and we had a horrible time getting through the islands. And then, when we saw your leading lights, I guessed at once that they were on the marks. So I came in under oars to tell you about tomorrow. Then we went to the camp and found nobody. Then we shouted a bit and came back to the harbour, and there was no Amazon." "Shall I make the tea?" said Peggy. "A round of tea would do us all a bit of good," said Captain John. No tea ever tasted better than this tea on Wildcat Island, while the first sunlight was creeping down from the tops of the opposite hills. "The sun's really coming up now," said Nancy. "We ought to start or we'll never be back in time. We'll get our supplies together, and first thing in the morning we'll set sail as early as ever we can, and we'll bring our tent, and then we'll make a raid on Captain Flint." When the Amazons had gone, Titty wanted to hear all about the raid, and John wanted to hear the whole story of the watch on the island and the way in which the able seaman had been able to capture the enemy ship. Titty told of the way she fell asleep and was wakened by a real owl and mistook it for the Swallow's signal, and of the coming of the Amazons, and of how she captured their ship and sailed away, and of how she heard the other pirates during the night. "What other pirates?" asked Susan. "They came in the dark, rowing," said Titty. "I heard them. They landed on Cormorant Island and buried their treasure there." "Fishermen, probably," said John. "No, they weren't," said Titty. "They nearly smashed their boat, and they swore." "How you do romance," said Susan. "You must have dreamed it," said John. The Swallows spent the day swimming, fishing, and getting ready for the coming of the Amazons. Shortly after breakfast on the following day, the Amazons arrived. "Have you heard the news?" said Nancy. "What news?" said John. "We haven't been off the island since we saw you yesterday." "Uncle Jim's houseboat has been burgled," said Peggy. "He should have listened to you when you went over to give him the message about putting a padlock on the houseboat." Captain John had explained all about the message on the morning when the Amazon had been captured, and Captain Nancy had agreed that he had done the right thing. "It happened the night you captured Amazon," said Nancy. Uncle Jim's neighbour knew that Uncle Jim was away, and when he saw lights in the houseboat, he became suspicious. So, in the morning, he went to see, and found the cabin door swinging open and the whole place upside down. He came over to tell Mother, and Mother sent a telegram to Uncle Jim. He got here last night and went to his houseboat, but everything was in such an awful mess that he came back with his parrot to our house to sleep. He said he wouldn't have minded if they'd taken everything he had except what they did take. They've taken his old cabin trunk with his typewriter in it and the book he's been writing all summer. He said he supposed they took it because it was heavy. I say, said John, were they burgling the very night of our war? Of course they were, said Nancy. I told you. If only we'd known, we could have captured the lot of them and made Uncle Jim our grateful slave forever. Then perhaps Titty really did hear something that night, said John. Perhaps the pirates I heard were the very ones who'd sacked Captain Flint's ship, said Titty. Did you hear any? Said Nancy. They were in a rowing boat, said Titty, when I was anchored in Amazon. They probably were the burglars, said Nancy. What beats me is why Uncle Jim wouldn't listen to you when you went over with the message. I think he thought it was us who put that firework on his cabin roof, said John. Nancy turned very red, even through her sunburn. I'll put that matter right at once, she said. Was he very beastly? He did call me a liar, said John. Peggy, said Captain Nancy. Sir, empty the rest of our stores out of Amazon, take the mast and sail out of her, and bring her round to the landing place. Mr. Mate, Captain John, have you got a pencil and a bit of paper in the camp? And I want a scrap of charcoal out of your fire. Captain John went into his tent and brought out the exercise book and pencil and gave them to Captain Nancy. She lay on the ground and wrote for some minutes, sucking the pencil between each word and pressing very hard. This is what she wrote. To Captain Flint, alias Uncle Jim. John never touched the houseboat. When you told him he was a liar, he wasn't. He had come at risk of his life to warn you that savage natives were planning an attack on your houseboat. Another native had given him a message for you. You wouldn't listen. Instead, you called him a liar. Talk about being ungrateful. Now you've been burgled. I'm glad. Very glad. If you want to know who singed your beard, see Philip of Spain, by exploding a mine on your cabin roof, it was the undersigned. You deserved it. This is the black spot. You are deposed from being an uncle or anything decent. Nancy Blackett, Amazon pirate. When she'd done, she got up and took a bit of charred wood from the fire. She tore out the sheet on which she'd been writing and smeared the back of it with burnt wood. Then she folded it up and put it in the pocket of her shirt. "Boat ready, sir," called Peggy from the landing place. "I'll be back soon," said Captain Nancy. "But what are you going to do?" asked John as Nancy pushed off. "Tip him the black spot," said Nancy, and rowed, rather splashingly, away. She returned about an hour later. She said nothing about her visit to Captain Flint, and no one questioned her about it. It was just before lunchtime when Captain Flint's rowing boat appeared off the island, heading for the landing place. The crews of the Swallow and the Amazon went down to the little beach and stood watching as the rowing boat ran up onto the beach. Captain Flint stepped ashore and walked across to John. "Young man," he said in a very friendly voice, "I've got something to say to you. Don't treat me in the way I treated you the other day and refused to listen to me. I was altogether in the wrong. It was beastly of me, even if I'd been in the right. I ought to have known that you were telling the truth, and I ought not to have called you a liar anyway. I'm very sorry. Will you shake hands?" There was a most unpleasant lump in Captain John's throat. He held out his hand. Captain Flint took it and shook it firmly. John felt suddenly better. "It's all right now," said he. "I really am most awfully sorry," said Captain Flint. "You know, I was quite sure it had been you because I saw your boat several times and never saw my wretched niece's." Captain Nancy and Peggy exchanged glances, but said nothing. "I've been paid for it, in a way," said Captain Flint. "Nancy tells me you came to warn me and give me a message or something. If I'd only listened to you instead of being a cross-grained, curmudgeonly idiot, I shouldn't have lost my book. I'd have taken it with me. Nancy's told you what's happened?" "Yes," said Captain John. "There's no more of the book writing, anyhow," said Captain Flint. "The book's gone, and the typewriter with it, and I'm too old to start writing it all over again. Look here, I'll do anything I can to make up. I've wasted my own summer writing a book, and I've wasted some of yours, too. Nancy's and Peggy's, I mean. But I see their tent is here, so I suppose you're all together in things. Take back your black spot and make peace with me." The swallows and the Amazons looked at one another for a moment. "All right," said Captain John on behalf of the swallows. "All right," said Captain Nancy on behalf of the Amazons. Captain John looked at Captain Flint and said, "All right." "Would you like to stop and have a bite to eat with us?" said Mate Susan. "I'll put the kettle on at once." Considering that Captain Flint was having lunch with his enemies, it was a very friendly meal. Even Titty softened towards him before the end of it. He never made the mistake of calling her anything but able seaman. They were sitting round the fire, getting the insides out of the potatoes, which were almost too hot to touch, when they began to talk about the burglary. "I wonder what made Mr. Dixon give you that message for me," said Captain Flint. He said he'd heard something at Bigland," said John. "Well, that's away beyond the foot of the lake," said Captain Flint. "If we could only find out where the burglar came from, there might be some chance of getting my box back. But there was nothing to show who he was or what he was. My boat looks as if 100 wildcats had been having a general scrimmage in the cabin, and that was all, except that they took my old cabin trunk. But everything that mattered was in it." "Was it a very heavy one?" asked Titty. "It was, rather." "Were there ingots in it?" Captain Flint laughed. "I'm afraid not," he said. "What there was a typewriter, a lot of diaries and old logs, and the book I've been writing all the summer. If they'd taken anything else, I wouldn't have minded." "Able Seaman Titty thinks she heard something that night," said John. "What did you hear, Able Seaman?" "I heard people rowing in a boat. They came close past me." "And where were you?" "I was anchored." "Look, here," said Captain John. "You'd better have a look at our chart. It shows just where she was." He ran to his tent and came out with the chart and pointed to the place where Titty had lain in Amazon off the north end of Cormorant Island. Captain Flint looked at it. "Did they pass close to you?" he asked. "Very close," said Titty. "It's a funny course for them to steer from my houseboat if they were making for the foot of the lake. They must have nearly run into the island." "They did run into it," said Titty. "And then they went on?" "They landed on the island," said Titty, "and they left their treasure there, or whatever it was they had with them. They said it was heavy. I heard them." Captain Flint jumped to his feet. "Able Seaman," he said, "if that box is there, I'll give you anything you'd like to have. Come on, all of you, and we'll row across and look." He grabbed Titty by the hand and shook it. They ran down to the landing place. In another moment they were rowing round the island and across to the island of the Cormorants. When they reached Cormorant Island, they found a place where they could pull the boat's nose up between two rocks, and everybody scrambled ashore. But there was nothing to be seen on the island, except the bare tree and the white-splashed rocks, and jetsam from the last flood, and big loose stones. They looked everywhere. Captain Flint climbed all round the island 2 or 3 times. He could find nothing. "But I know they left it here," said Able Seaman Titty. "I heard them say they couldn't put it on a motor bicycle." "It was the middle of the night, you know, Titty," said Susan, "and you may have been mistaken." "They may have changed their minds," said Captain Flint. or they may have come for it already. Anyway, it's something to know which end of the lake they came from. Not that I think I shall ever get it back," he added. They rowed sadly back to Wildcat Island. Titty went to sleep that night with one idea firm in her head. And when she woke up the next morning, it was still there. She crawled out to see what sort of a day it was. It was a fine day without much wind, just what she wanted. For she knew that if there had been a strong wind, she wouldn't have been allowed to go off in Swallow by herself without the captain or the mate. While they were having breakfast, she said, "I'm going to look for the treasure again." "Can I come too?" said Roger. "Yes, if you want," said Titty. "But we all looked for it yesterday, and there's nothing there," said Susan. "I'm sure it's there," said Titty obstinately. "It's our last day, and I want to have one more look." "Yeah, but Captain Flint's coming," said John, "and we're all going fishing." "I'd rather go treasure hunting than fishing," said Roger. "You'll be awfully disappointed, Titty," said Susan. "Not when I find it," said Titty. "Well, don't be too long," said the mate. "You'll see where we go with Captain Flint, and when you're tired of the island, you can come. We'll take your fishing rods." They walked down to the harbour. John took the mast and sail out of Swallow. Everybody wished them good luck, and the able seaman and the boy set off, Titty poling the Swallow out of the harbour. Cormorant Island was little more than a heap of rocks and stones sticking up out of the water. There was some heather on it, a little grass, but very little, and 2 trees, both dead. One of the trees was lying on the rocks. It had been uprooted a long time ago, and the ground about it was nothing but great stones. The other tree, gaunt and bare, splashed with the white droppings of the birds, was the perching place of the cormorants. Titty rowed slowly round the island. "It looks as if we could come alongside that rock," she said, "but we won't try to beach her. Captain John said we were to be careful about landing, so look out." There was just a little bump as the Swallow touched the rock, but it wasn't a bad one. The able seaman scrambled out with the painter and held the gunwale while the boy followed. "Shall I bring the compass?" he said. "No," said the able seaman. "We'll leave it in the ship until we need it. But bring the pickaxe." It was very hard going on those rocks, for they stuck up at all angles. There were deep clefts between them, big enough to take a foot and small enough to make it difficult to get the foot out again. Then there were lots of loose stones which slipped all ways when you trod on them. It took the treasure hunters a long time even to get from one end of the island to the other. "I'm glad we live on Wildcat Island and not here," said Roger. "This is a real desert island," said Titty. "Keep a lookout for a skeleton." They went on with the search. Half an hour passed, and Roger began to lose heart. They sat down on the flat rock at the north end of the island where they'd left their provisions. They got the bottle of milk out of Swallow, ate their sandwiches, and took turns in bubbling the milk out of the bottle into their mouths. "There's Captain Flint and the others," said Titty. "They're all in his boat, over there." "I wonder how many whales they'd caught," said Roger. "Sharks, too, perhaps. Anyhow, lots of perch." "It's much better to find treasure than just to sit catching fish," said Titty. "But we haven't found any," said Roger. "We haven't nearly looked everywhere yet. Must be here," said Titty. "Come on, you hunt one side and I'll hunt the other. Shout if you find it." Time went on. The morning was gone and the afternoon was going, and still there was no sign of anything that might mean treasure. Titty had worked at least twice right round the island. Roger stopped looking and went and sat on the rock to which Swallow's painter was tied. Titty was crawling along the rocks at the very edge of the island, not far away. Suddenly, Roger saw her jump up with something in her hand. "Hi, Roger!" she called. Roger stood up and climbed along the rocks towards her. "I found a pipe!" she shouted. "It must have belonged to one of the pirates. This must be the place where they landed." It was an ordinary wooden pipe. She'd found it between 2 stones close to the edge of the water. The finding of it made a great difference to the island. Titty had begun to think that perhaps she must have dreamed of the pirates landing here that night in the dark, but now she had in her hand a solid proof that someone had been there. "If they landed here," she said, "the treasure must be close by. They didn't go far away, because I heard them banging about all the time." They looked carefully about them. They were close to the place where the old tree had stood, the tree that was now lying on its side with its rotted, dried roots straggling in the air. The ground was covered with big, loose stones. Titty went carefully over them and round the tree. She found nothing. She went round the tree again in a widening circle. Still nothing. She went back to her task of working right round the edge of the island. Roger stayed where he was, and presently began to amuse himself by gathering small driftwood and dead reeds that were stuck among the rocks, and had been drying there since the last time the lake was high after the rains. At last, Titty began to lose hope again. She came back to the fallen tree and Roger with his growing pile of fuel. "Shall we light it, Titty?" said Roger. The able seaman looked at it. "That's not the way," she said. "We'll make a fireplace. Then we'll light a fire in it, and Captain Flint and the others will see the smoke of our fire." She began building with small stones. "When they see the smoke of our fire on the desert island far away, they'll come and there'll be a rescue. Now we need a good big stone to go at the back." She pulled at a biggish flat stone close by the roots of the old tree. It moved easily, and as it moved, all thought of making fireplaces flew out of Titty's mind. "Help! Roger!" she shouted. "Where's the pickaxe?" Roger picked it up and gave it to her. Titty tapped with it at a black corner of iron that showed under the stone she'd moved. It rang of metal and wood. She pulled the stone further, and it was clear that she had uncovered the iron-bound corner of a box. "We've found it! We've found it! We've found it!" shouted Titty. She pulled the stone right away to one side, and there was a torn label on the corner of the box. A label with a picture of a camel and a pyramid and the word Cairo, plain, in big letters. Quickly, she cleared away the other stones and uncovered the box completely. In the middle of the lid were the two letters J.T. Titty and Roger looked across the lake, expecting to find the others where they'd last seen them, fishing south of the island near the opposite shore. But the whaling party was now more than halfway across the lake and rowing steadily towards them. Titty climbed up and stood on the fallen trunk of the tree and waved and shouted. Captain Flint bent to his oars, and a few minutes later the whaling party reached Cormorant Island. Captain Flint was ashore in a moment and jumping over the rocks. The others followed. "You haven't really found anything, have you?" he said. But before they could answer, he had seen the box. "Well done, able seaman," he shouted. "Good for you, Titty," said Captain John. "Then you weren't dreaming after all," said Susan. "Whoever would have thought it," said Peggy. "Well, shiver me timbers," said Nancy. Captain Flint dropped on his knees beside the box and pulled a bunch of keys from his pocket. He unlocked it, threw back the clasps, and lifted the lid. Inside was a typewriter in a black case, a lot of canvas-bound diaries, and a huge bundle of typewritten paper. "That's all right," said Captain Flint, fingering the bundle as if he loved it. "Able seaman, I can never thank you enough. If I'd lost this, as I thought I had, I'd have lost all the diaries of my pirate past. And I put all the best of my life into this book. It would have gone forever if it hadn't been for you." He hove the big box on his shoulder and carried it to his boat. "I must go off at once to tell the police to stop making inquiries," he said. As he rowed off across the lake, they all piled into the Swallow and steered a course for home. It was to be their last night on Wildcat Island. Next morning, after breakfast, they took down their tents and gathered together their supplies. They looked sadly round their camping ground. There was now nothing but the fireplace with its feebly burning fire, and the square, pale patches where the tents had been, to show that it had ever been the home of explorers and their pirate friends. "When we've gone," said Titty, "someone else may discover it. They'll know it's a camp, because of the fireplace, but they'll think the natives made it. If anybody takes it, we'll barbecue them, said Nancy. It's our island, yours and ours, and we'll defend it against anybody. We're going to school at the end of the summer, said Peggy. So are we, said Susan. Well, we shan't be at school forever, said Nancy. We'll be grown up, and then we'll live here all the year round. So will we, said Titty, and in the winter we'll fetch our food over the ice on sledges. I shall be going to sea some day, said John, and so will Roger, but we'll always come back here on leave. Well, it's no good hanging about, said Nancy. Let's put to sea. Everything left was carried down to the harbour and stowed in the ships. Susan emptied the kettle on the fire. Then they put to sea. The waves were quite small, and the wind was light, but there was a strong swell. Wind's from the south, said Captain Nancy. We'll beat into it. We'll follow you, said Captain John. He wanted Swallow to be the last to leave. In Swallow, Roger was in the bows, Able Seaman Titty was in the bottom of the boat, and Susan and John in the stern. Doesn't Amazon look fine, said Susan, looking at the little white-sailed boat ahead of them, with her fluttering black and white flag and her 2 red-capped sailors. Swallow must look just as fine, said Captain John. Finer, said Titty. We've got a brown sail. They sailed on, tacking from one side of the lake to the other and back again. They were passed by one of the big lake steamers crowded with passengers who came to the side and pointed. The captain, who was steering her, took out his binoculars and looked through them at the little Swallow. By now the news had run all over Rio and up and down the lake about the way in which the Swallows had found the box that had been stolen from Mr. Turner's houseboat. Suddenly, a loud cheer sounded over the water, and again, and again. The passengers waved their hats and shouted. "What is the matter with the natives in the steamer?" said Roger. Then one of the sailors ran aft to the flagstaff at the steamer's stern, and the big red ensign dropped to half-mast and then rose again. "They're cheering at us," said Captain John, turning very red. "They've saluted," said Susan. "Oughtn't we to answer? The Amazons are." They could see Peggy at the halyards, busy dipping the Jolly Roger. Titty lowered Swallow's flag and raised it again. "It's a good thing we are going away," said Captain John. The steamer hurried on. The wind was dropping now, and on the Swallow the boom swung aft, and the main sheet now and then caught the water and trailed in it. "Sit on the lee side, Able Seaman," said John. "That'll keep the boom out." Nancy in Amazon was sitting on the lee side for the same reason. Wildcat Island was now far behind them. The island was once more the uninhabited island that Titty had watched for so many days from the peak of Darien. And yet it was not that island. John, looking at it, remembered the harbour and the leading lights. For Roger, it would always be the place where he had swum for the first time. For Susan, it was the camp and housekeeping and cooking for a large family. Titty thought of it as Robinson Crusoe's island. It was her island more than anyone's because she had been alone on it. As they passed Houseboat Bay, Captain Flint rowed out to say goodbye. "Goodbye," they shouted. "Till next year," he shouted back, and rested on his oars and watched the fleet as it sailed slowly on towards the peak of Darien. Under the peak of Darien, the fleet broke up. There were shouts of "Goodbye," "Remember the Alliance," and "Come again next year." "3 cheers for Wildcat Island," shouted John. They all cheered. "3 cheers for the Swallows," shouted Nancy. "And for the Amazons," they shouted back. John hauled his wind and stood in for the Hollyhow boathouse. Amazon held on her course. She was soon out of sight beyond the further point of the bay.